Yeah, welcome to the CGO's 2022 webinar conference series, and it's my pleasure to introduce our president, Ted Courtney. Take it away, Ted.
Well, thank you, Sue. It's my honor as president to be able to welcome all of you to our 42nd annual conference of the Council of Georgist Organizations. And as you know, the whole idea of the Council of Georgist Organizations is to once a year get together and kind of exchange information about what we're doing, about the progress we're making, and to learn from one another. And it becomes a social event also in which we like to shake hands and talk with people and learn more about them. I'm going to take you back 20 years more, back to 60 years ago. That was in 1962, and I had just become a Georgist when I was in college. And I was 22 years of age at the time. And I had read about some of these famous people like Mason Gaffney and Arch Woodruff and oh boy, the other people that are famous, Bob Adelson, Perry Prentice, and so forth.
Perry Prentice. Yeah.
So anyway, I finally learned that by attending the conferences that were held every once in a while, either by the Henry George School or by the International Union for Land Value Taxation, you could meet these people. So that was my introduction to the whole idea of having annual meetings. And I welcome all of you who are attending to join us and to make contributions to our organization. If you look at the last page on the agenda, on the brochure that was sent out, you'll see that there are 22 organizations and individuals who have made contributions to this year's conference. So we invite you to also make a contribution. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening. Dan Sullivan is going to be the chairman of the event, hosting it. And we're going to be featuring Heather Remoff. And Dan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, basically, Henry George in Progress and Poverty, he devoted there were 10 books of several chapters each, and he devoted an entire book to disproving Malthus and disproving, incidentally disproving an aspect of Darwin, because Darwin himself said that his theory was Malthus extended to the entire animal and vegetable kingdoms. And so the reason Darwin was wrong was that Malthus was wrong, that people don't go extinct by overpopulating, which was Darwin's version of it, was that but also that people don't overpopulate. And this has been corroborated since then. We had I guess demographers, I'm trying to remember what is, people who studied population control, and what they found was that overpopulation doesn't cause poverty, that poverty causes overpopulation. In other words, people who have adequate resources reproduce enough to make use of those resources, but not to extend themselves horribly. But the very poor people will have lots of children, and one of the reasons for that is that as you become elderly, if you're very poor, your 2 children cannot sustain you and sustain themselves. But if you have 10 children, they can each pitch in a little bit and sustain you a little bit. So that's one of the theories as to why that is. But in general, they found that very, very poor populations tend to reproduce quickly, and that all the things that Malthus called positive checks, which were war, pestilence, and famine, were the 3 main categories. And all those things triggered massive increases in population, that a people will increase their population very rapidly, both in the aftermath of a war and in anticipation of a war, and that they will increase their population in the aftermath of pestilence. I don't think they anticipated pestilence, so there's nothing on that. But Heather has some other things in which she thinks that Darwin also made some mistakes. And I don't know that Darwin was wrong overall, because Darwin really innovated like specialization, the idea of adaptation, of species adapting to fit into niches with other species that fit into niches, that certain insects had very long snouts to get into long stem flowers, and that those flowers might have even evolved so that only those insects would draw from them. And there's a lot of complicated things that Darwin really advanced. So I don't want to badmouth Darwin overall, but I just wanted to say that as a Georgist, you know, his big mistake was that he copied Malthus, and that the anti-Darwin backlash was not religion against science. It was actually that Darwin stepped into a raging moral controversy, because Malthus was making excuses for the landed aristocracy and closing the commons. And that was offensive to Christians everywhere, not just Christian conservatives, but Christian liberals, and was offensive to people like William Godwin, who Malthus was actually answering Godwin, and Godwin was an atheist. So when this whole controversy arose, Malthus, who was an Episcopal deacon, was on the side of on the opposite side from the fundamentalist Christians today. And Godwin, who was a godless atheist, was on the same side as the fundamentalist Christians today. So the strange evolution of Darwinism is an interesting topic in itself. But I wanted to get into, I wanted to find out more, because Heather has delved deeply into this and did so even before she knew about Henry George, and advanced even more by tying the two together. So that's enough of an introduction. Go ahead, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I don't agree with everything you said, but I do agree with a lot of it. First of all, I'd like to thank CGO and also Shepheard-Walwyn for publishing my book. I'm very, very grateful to both of you. And I'm also happy to, oh, thanks, Dan. I'm happy that the Georgists are talking about the commons, that the commons is such an emphasis here, because my major concern today is with the climate change. And I think the Georgist solution to, that we will have no good solution to climate change that does not include the Georgist solution. But the title of my talk today is What's Sex Got to Do with Henry George? Love, Lust, and Climate Change. And that's a play on the title of my book. The title of my book is What's Sex Got to Do with It? Darwin, Love, Lust, and the Anthropocene. Now, 2 years ago on Thanksgiving, I learned from Shepheard-Walwyn that they were going to publish my book. And I was so excited. My granddaughter, who's 35 and single and a bit of a wild thing, she called me to wish me a happy Thanksgiving. And I said, oh, Erin, darling, I really have something to be thankful about. I learned that there's a publisher in the UK who's going to publish my book, What's Sex Got to Do with It? And she said, oh my God, Babu, is that really the name that's going to be a bestseller? Is that really the title? I said, Erin, don't get too excited. It's a rather scholarly book. And the full title of it is What's Sex Got to Do with It? Darwin, Love, Lust, and the Anthropocene. She said, well, Babu, I don't want you to worry about it. I may have to Google that A word, but I'm all over those two L words. And actually, Erin is not the only one who has to Google that A word, the Anthropocene. I myself learned it probably only 5 years ago from a science writer. And many of my friends, some of whom have advanced degrees, don't know what the Anthropocene is. And just for those listening, it's the extinction event that's based on human activity, as in anthropology. So it's an extinction event not caused by a meteor or a volcanic eruption or something, but actually by human activity. And that's what the Anthropocene is. Now, how is it that Darwin introduced me to Henry George? And he did. I used to be such a fan of Darwin, Dan. He was my absolute hero. You know, those imaginary dinners, those dead or alive dinners, when they ask you if you were throwing a dinner party, who would be the 5 or 8 people that you would invite? Darwin always headed my list. I was so much a Darwinian. And so when I was doing my graduate work at Rutgers, I was interested in Darwin's theory of sexual selection. Actually, the theory of natural selection had many fathers. Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace really were not the fathers of the theory of natural selection. Darwin's own grandfather postulated theories of natural selection. Was very, very common. Many people were. What Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace did was they gave the explanation for how this adaptation would occur. And they got that from Malthus. So both Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, they now had a way to explain how natural selection worked. And Malthus had given it to them in his writings, The Principles of Population. But as Dan has explained, Malthus was very, very wrong in that. He got it wrong. And he introduced, therefore, a mistake into the theory of natural selection that made it very numbers dependent, which it actually is not. And as I say somewhere in my book, that I refer to it as Darwin's Malthusian flaw. He based his whole theory on behavior, on human behavior. This, as Dan pointed out, the way we drop our numbers. Darwin was very, very concerned. He felt that the species was going to retrograde, in his words, unless we changed the way women were having children. Now, he was obviously talking about English children, English women, because he felt that Irish women were having way, way, way too many children, and that was his concern. And he thought, wow, unless we get English women to have more children, the species is going to retrograde. So he based his whole theory on what he saw as detrimental to human evolution is actually the way humans, that's how we reproduce. As Dan pointed out, when we have sufficient resources, we reduce the number of children we have. So Darwin was mistaken in that. But anyhow, I entered Rutgers to do my dissertation, to work on my dissertation for my PhD in anthropology, not in biology or genetics. And I was very interested in sexual selection. And so I set up a study in which I interviewed women as to how they selected the men in their lives. I took a tape recorder with me and interviewed them in individually open-ended interviews. And those interviews ran from 3 to 5 hours in length. And every word, I tried not to lead the women. I simply asked them to talk to me about the men in their lives. And they did at length. And whenever they would say this man was sexy or this man was wonderful or it was love at first sight, I would ask, okay, what traits triggered that reaction? And then I correlated those traits to their reproductive success, whether the men that the women described as successful had the largest number of children. I was operating under a Darwinian premise, strictly a Darwinian premise. And I assumed that the most successful men would father the most children, and that women would be careless users of birth control with men who weren't good father material. In fact, nothing, I got the exact opposite results that I was expecting. And I realized, wow, First of all, women didn't begin to use birth control until they met a man that they wanted to father their children. So birth control was used more for timing than it was for pregnancy prevention. It was almost like women didn't consider that they might actually get pregnant until they met a man who made them want to be pregnant. So that the results of that were totally contrary to what I expected. But the big difference for me was the thing that Dan had talked about, how the most successful, the people with the best control of resources, the most reliable control of resources, have the fewest number of children. And that was totally opposite of what I expected. So I left Rutgers knowing that neither Darwin nor I knew nearly enough about economics. I knew nothing about economics, but I sensed there's something in human economic behavior that Darwin hasn't accounted for. So I began on a self-taught course in economics. I lived in Philadelphia at the time, and I would dutifully trek up to the Philadelphia Library and check out all the famous economists and take their books home and read them. And none of them made sense to me. I would always find some internal logical inconsistency that made me reject the standard economists. I was lucky, and I recently learned a term that I think is pertinent to everything, called anchor bias. And that means that the first thing you learn about a subject gets so lodged in your brain that it's very, very difficult to argue for a paradigm shift. And I think I'm up against that when it comes to trying to convince folks that Darwin has gotten a few things about human evolution wrong, particularly human evolution. In fact, two things pretty wrong about understanding human evolution. And I now attribute that to anchor bias. That I had anchor bias myself. I was, so shocked when my research did not prove.
Is anchor bias something like confirmation bias, only
It's a little
stronger?
bit, yeah. It's like the first. I've learned. I Googled it like my granddaughter with the Anthropocene. It's the most difficult bias to overcome. The first thing you learn about a subject gets lodged in there so tightly. So with economics, I didn't have any anchor bias because I'd never been exposed except to, basic, as an undergraduate, basic economics course, law of supply and demand, etc. So anyhow, I'm dutifully checking out books on economics. None of them are pleasing me. None of them seem logical. And one day I'm checking out, and when I was young in high school, I briefly attended a Quaker boarding school called George School. And so I was checking out my stack of economics books, and there's a little flyer by the checkout counter at the Philadelphia Library that said, Henry George School of Economics, free courses in economics. Well, it caught my eye. The George School part of it really caught my eye. I thought, oh, wow, free courses in economics. I walked by Henry George's birthplace all the time on my way to the Reading Terminal Market. And what am I doing with all these books that seem so illogical to me? I'll go take the course at the birthplace. And I did, and George Collins was the instructor. And because I'm a bit of a contrarian, I'm resisting everything I'm learning. I'm writing in the margins, oh, no, you don't hurt Henry. Oh, no, that can't be so. Until he began to talk about Malthus. And I thought, oh, neither Henry George nor I have a very high opinion of Thomas Malthus. And so at that point, I began to soften toward Henry George. And George Collins, of course, was a wonderful instructor. And one day when I anticipated what was coming in the next lesson, and George referred to me as clever. Oh, how clever you are to have anticipated that. I was hooked. All it took was that little bit of praise. And so I saw the cat at that moment. And I, ever since, feel that there's almost no social problem that you can throw at me that I couldn't explain how a Georgia solution would make that, would correct for that problem. So that's that's how Charles Darwin introduced me to Henry George. Now, in the books that I've written now, I really take a very different approach to human evolution than Charles Darwin did. Because of course, so many things have happened. I mean, all the genetic discoveries have happened since Darwin's time. So we can't expect him to know that. But in terms of his theory of sexual selection, which is the theory I'm most fascinated with, here's a theorist who declared that female choice drove sexual selection, was responsible for sexual selection. And yet because, he was a terrible misogynist, he absolutely, in his own words, he says that civilized women, since civilized women are no longer intelligent enough to make informed choices. And since Darwin believed that women were not smart enough to make choices, he therefore ignored the behavior, totally ignored the behavior of 51% of the population. Now, how can you argue for a theory of sexual selection, base it on female choice, which he did, and then dismiss 51% of the population? So
Dismiss
Darwin,
the choosers.
it dismissed the choosers, pay no attention. So that was, he sets himself up to fail in that regard, and I think he did fail. The other error that I think Darwin made, women get men's attention based on female beauty. Men are attracted by beauty. Women select for a whole range of things. But the other mistake that Darwin made was to take the trait that influenced his choice, beauty, and project it onto the women doing the choosing. In fact, women don't select for beauty. They select for a whole range of other traits. And Darwin believed, because it was the peacock's tail that, he famously said, whenever I look at a peacock's tail, it makes me sick, because he didn't know how to explain the evolution of the peacock's tail, given that he saw beauty as being non-functional. And he felt that traits that were selected for were going to, contribute to the reproductive success of or just to the general adaptation of the species. And so how can beauty be functional? So what he did, his theory of sexual selection, was really only to explain beauty. He assumed that females of all species chose for nothing other than beauty. And in that, he was seriously wrong. Now, my update to Darwin that I cannot hold him to account for. I will hold him to account for being such a misogynist that he ignored 51% of the population, but he didn't know genetics. And I am convinced that the origin of the human species is not the result of slow, gradual natural selection, but in fact was a result of an end-to-end chromosome fusion. That's a rather dramatic change. We went almost overnight from being a species with 24 chromosome pairs to being a species with 23 chromosome pairs. That's a very, very, very major change. And that I hypothesized that had system-wide, body-wide changes, many body-wide changes. And there's a Spanish researcher who says that the area where the changes would be most apparent would be in the genes near the ends where those telomeres allow the end-to-end chromosome fusion to occur. And that's in the area of sex in the brain. And I think at that moment of the origin of our species, that dramatic change affected the way our brains process symbolic information, and also introduced reproductively very dramatic change, concealed ovulation in humans. So those are the two big things that change the symbolic communication and concealed ovulation. Of all the mammals, we are the only one that has concealed ovulation. All the others have periods of estrus where the females, so-called, like cats, dogs, etc., farm animals, in heat. And at that moment, she attracts the attention of all the males. And then once she's out of heat, they more or less ignore her. With concealed ovulation, humans do not have an obvious estrus cycle. We also have continual sexual receptivity, which other species don't have. So to me, this puts a whole lot of power into the hands of women, in that we can do a lot of studying, understanding. We have a lot more choice than otherwise. So those are the two big things. And the symbolic communication is a huge one. All species communicate. I think plants even, do communicate. I shouldn't say even, I think plants communicate. All species have communication, but only humans have symbolic communication or language. We're the only ones with language. That's an astonishing thing. Of all the trillions of species that have evolved in all the billions of years of life on this planet, only one species, only one, humans, has evolved symbolic communication. And it's our double-edged sword. It's what makes us exceptional. It's responsible for all the wonderful things that we can do, art, music, literature. The idea that we can share ideas and discoveries with humans that we don't even know around the world. We can share ideas and discoveries with people who've lived centuries before us. Any one individual has access, because of symbolic communication, to all the adaptations and discoveries that any other animal of our species has. That's astonishing. So it enables us to do brilliant and wonderful things, technologically, art, literature, music, but it also enables us to control resources symbolically. And that's the dangerous edge of that double-edged sword. Because what humans do, every other species controls the resources it needs in order to raise its young and survive with the strength of its own body. And because the members of the species are roughly equivalent in size, there's equitable distribution of the available resources. With humans, no. If Jeff Bezos had to control the resources that he owns only with the strength of his own body, would he have the kind of wealth that he does? No, not possible. It's symbolic communication, language, written deeds. We set up barriers that keep others out. And I see that as, those two things are the most significant things about human evolution. And the correction for that excessive control in the hands of one or two people is the Georgist solution, by collecting the economic rent that accrues to those resources that are controlled symbolically. If we could do that, we would not only have an equitable society, we would not be doing the kind of damage to the climate that we are. And so I think, I've sort of rushed through it, but that's the difference between humans and other species. And it's like
John Locke tied it to money.
I'm sorry,
John Locke, he talked about the limits of, your right of access to land was limited by there being enough and is good left to others. Then he said nobody bothered to violate that until the introduction of money, because once there was money, you could get paid to you could have somebody pay you to use land you weren't using. So now you had an incentive to hold land that you weren't using, so other people would pay you so they could use it.
Yep.
And so that's kind of a further extension of that, because I think even before that, there was, symbolic territorial dominion. The old common law societies had, the most favored people had the best land, and other people were relegated to poorer land. And that was done through a quasi-governmental system, but there was not much money in the system, so you didn't actually have a great deal of tenantry. You just had, okay, you're relegated to the poor land because you have less political influence.
Yeah, and I also argue that the human brain really is not a skilled worker. It evolved to be good at two really basic things, at reproduction and survival. And our language ability, with the birth of language, and I think that was the result of that initial end-to-end chromosome fusion. I think there was a change, something in the way the brain processes information changed as a result of that fusion. And I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, Dan, I was forgetting. Something you'd said reminded me of it. But, with the birth of language, and language is, welcome to Homo sapiens. Language is what makes us who we are. With the birth of language was born the ability to lie. And we are really skilled at lying to ourselves. Self-deception and deceit, our skill with self-deception and deceit, really basic to who we are. And we can kid ourselves about our own motives, and we do. I look at our various politicians. Some of them, are doing things that seem so outrageous to me, and yet I'm aware they've probably convinced themselves that what they're doing is not for personal gain, but because what they're doing is going to make the world better. We're really, really good at that. And so there are things we have to rise above as humans. And that's some of our species-specific behavior that we have to rise above. We have to be aware that we do kid ourselves. Just because we believe something, that we've done something good, doesn't mean we're quite as good as we think we are. But written deeds too, the introduction of written language, now we have written deeds. And anytime there's a government formed, property rights are one of the first things that people want to protect. But by collecting the economic rent, we can stop humans from doing the two most damaging things we do, which is create inequality and damage the planet.
Thank you for watching this video. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are in the description box. So please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's surprisingly helpful in getting our ideas out. So until next time, keep reading.